Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished professional from Cape Town, South Africa, Mr. Michael Haupt. Michael, welcome to the show.
Very good to meet you. I'm looking forward to our conversation, Ashutosh.
Thank you. Michael is a resilience strategist, and he is behind the launch of the RISE framework and institute. RISE is a network of resilient, integrated stewardship ecosystem. So, Michael, my first question, what initially drew you to the concept of resilience, and how has your understanding evolved over the years?
If I may just take a little bit of a step back, I'm a little concerned that you've included me in the group of successful people that you've interviewed.
I think so.
Because I have a very different definition of what success is. So if I may just frame our conversation, that even before we get into resilience, is that my worldview is that the systems that we've relied on to build what we now determine success are now standing in a very vulnerable place. And that I think we're in the process of redefining what success means. So when we talk about success in the rest of this conversation, we're talking about success in a field that appears to be emerging. And just to explain what I mean by that, I've had to look at the rise and fall of various empires through the ages, and it appears to me that we're at the end of the empire that has been responsible for driving a huge amount of economic growth ever since the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And now we're looking at different forms of growth. And so that was a bit of an introduction to why I talk about resilience. You're probably aware that in the corporate space, there's a huge amount of talk around sustainability.
Correct.
And sustainability means the ability to continue doing business as usual without us affecting in any way our return to shareholders and our return on investment and profits and so on. Whereas many are now looking more at what does it mean to build resilience, which means an ability to bounce back from any kind of systemic shocks. And there are three specific areas that I look at as far as systemic shocks are concerned. I don't know if I should take a break there or just
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
So the three significant areas are in ecology, economy, and social.
Yeah.
Ecology obviously is all of the environmental concerns that people are worried about: climate change, extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, a reduce in the number of resources that we rely on. That's both from a food perspective as well as manufacturing perspective. So all of that fits into the ecological bucket that we need to be concerned about from a resilience perspective. And being able to bounce back from a systemic shock means any major earthquake, any extreme event, how quickly can we recover? I can tell you some stories around that. Or let's just cover the other two angles.
Please, by all means, my audience loves to listen to my guests more than they want to listen to me. So let's talk about all the three, the ecological, the economic, and the social resilience. And by all means, tell us stories, because that's the best way to remember the conversation.
Well, so a quick example around ecological resilience. If you remember in December, I think it was 2006, you had the major tsunami that hit your part of the world, Southeast Asia. And not long after, there was Hurricane Katrina in the US.
Yeah.
Now, what surprised me, I'd spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia just before the tsunami. In fact, I left Khao Lak Beach in Thailand literally 4 days before the tsunami hit. So, I knew a lot of the people there. It was a pretty traumatic thing for me, even though I wasn't there. The point of the story, though, is that the way Southeast Asia recovered from that incredibly horrific event was a demonstration of very high levels of resilience. So the people got together and very quickly, literally within 24 hours, were already rebuilding. Whereas Hurricane Katrina in the US, it took many, many months of people huddling in shelters and, waiting for the government to come and do something. That is, to me, an example of very low resilience and high fragility. So the community was not able to bounce back from that systemic shock, whereas they were able to do that in Southeast Asia.
And why would you say this happened differently in these two different parts of the world?
It's a mindset whereby communities, and I have to be careful of how I say this, but the mindset is one of either interdependence, where we as a community depend on each other and we get together and make stuff happen. And that's very much the Southeast Asian mindset, or a mindset of dependence. And unfortunately, in North America, there has come to be a dependence on so-called leaders, governments to step in and do something. But what happens at the end of empire, and as we started this call by saying, it appears to me that we are near the end of empire, your structures that you've come to rely on become increasingly unreliable. And so therefore, it's a key part of resilience is not to rely on those structures that we relied on in the past.
Very, very interesting. So, we've spoken about ecological resilience. And then we'll go to the other two, but one or two questions on ecological resilience. That what are some key indicators of ecological resilience that you have seen in all your travel?
Well, I've just given one, which was the tsunami, but so firstly, let's give some examples of where I've seen ecological resilience declining. So in my earlier career, I was in the corporate space implementing high-end computer systems all over the world. I've lived in 16 cities on 6 continents.
Wow.
And there was a wide amount of travel involved. So I stopped counting the number of unique destinations when I hit 400. It was just too much for me to keep a record of them. But many of those places I would go back to 3 or 4 or 5 years later, and you could immediately sense that something was different. Now, at the time, I couldn't put my finger on it. But now that I've been doing this for more than 20 years, even things like, on islands and so on, I used to visit a lot of islands, specifically in Southeast Asia. And in the early days, you would see family-run, beautiful, tiny little resorts. Those resorts have now all been taken over by 5-star hotel chains. And as a result, you can see the beaches being degraded because being on an island, it's very difficult to deal with runoff and sewage and all the rest effectively. So the beaches are now nowhere near as pristine as what they were previously. Now that to us, we determine that as progress. There's more expensive 5-star hotels and there's supposedly generating more income for the local communities. But in the process, you're destroying the area that, or the look and feel and the beauty that originally attracted people to come and visit. So to me, that's not resilient because it's not long-term sustainable.
And, you gave me a very, very interesting example of the tsunami versus Katrina, and a little bit of understanding of why these two areas may be different. But what, in your view, are some of the challenges to implement ecological resistance strategies in different regions?
Well, it's not only
Is it
different
government,
regions.
is it political, is it social, or is it just people coming together?
Well, you're asking a question that touches on all of those areas. And as a result, I've had to create a word, and the word is called interstructure. So you're familiar with the word infrastructure, which is the roads and bridges and all the physical things that make a society work. But then you also have all of the social structures that make a society work, like your government system, your law enforcement system, education system, health system. Now, all of those are interconnected and intertwined, and there are relationships between all of them. So I had to come up with a word that describes all of that together, which is an interstructure. And that entire interstructure is now fragile because we're reaching the end of this globalized empire. And what was interesting for me to discover is that in my research of the various rise and falls of empires over the past 5,000 years, every empire has been formed as a class-based empire.
Mm-hmm.
So you had the powerful at the top and everybody else down at the bottom.
Yeah.
And eventually the powerful at the top end up hollowing out the middle of society because they're trying to accumulate as much as they can before the empire inevitably collapses.
Mm.
So the same thing is happening now. So your question was, how do we get to the point of building ecological resilience?
Mm.
And the issue to me appears to be that there is an incentive system that continues propping up the class-based system. And the class-based system is designed to extract. So there's no incentive for building resilience ecologically. Of course, I am aware that we're talking about sustainability, and in the corporate space, it's ESG, and there's, this veneer of showing an interest in saving the planet.
Yeah.
But it's not happening because your incentive mechanisms keep the extraction machine going.
Mm.
So there's a long-winded way of saying right now we've not yet figured out how to coordinate large-scale human activity towards rebuilding ecology at the scale that it needs to happen. I can tell you about many examples happening around the world, but it's still too small at this
This is
stage.
fascinating. But given our time constraint, I want to now move to economic resilience. Tell me a little bit about your understanding of economic resilience. Give me one or two interesting examples how communities can build economic resilience, especially in the face of global economic uncertainty.
So let's first of all take quite a big step back and understand how and why our current economic system is fragile. And to understand that, I highly recommend a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. And to me, the most important chapter in that fairly lengthy book, it's a big book to wade your way through because he gives lots of examples. But the key chapter in that book is chapter 8, where he basically explains that through the rise and falls of civilizations, we've also experienced a swing of a pendulum in an economic sphere that swings from debt-based monetary systems to credit-based monetary systems. And the past 5,000, I beg your pardon, since the Industrial Revolution, our monetary systems have been very much in the debt-based part of that pendulum swing. And if he's correct that we do swing between these two mechanisms as empires rise and fall, then it means that we're swinging towards more of a mutual credit type system. Now, I'm not an economist, so I won't be able to dive into a huge amount of detail here. But basically, it's community issued currencies. And we've seen a lot of that happening with the emergence of various crypto tokens and so on. But even long before crypto appeared, there were examples of, for example, the Austrian community during World War I issued their own script. They had little stamps, little pieces of paper, and they stamped on it. It was called the Wurzel. There's a whole history behind that, which we probably won't have time to go into. And it became so successful that the powers that be eventually banned the system. They didn't want the community to be as independent as they proved themselves to be. So now the challenge is to implement those community currencies, but we have such low trust, and this is what I'm seeing from communities all around the world, that it's only a small number of people that manage to get these community currencies issued and traded, and the rest of the community are still very skeptical. So for these community issued currencies to work, we've got to first look at trust, building trust amongst each other, particularly across racial divides. You've seen all over the world, there's different divisions happening, whether it's gender, whether it's color of skin, whether it's migrant or local. There's just so much division happening, and it's very difficult to implement these community currencies when trust is so low. So I kept the conversation at a fairly high level.
You're right. But tell me then, Michael.
My point in all of that, if I may, is to make the point that within our current debt-based monetary system, it's impossible to build resilience. It seems completely unlikely that our current monetary system can continue the way it is. With the amount of debt that's being issued, there comes a breaking point at some point. I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. But in order for us to bounce back from that systemic shock when it happens, we have to then look at mutual credit currencies rather than debt-based currencies. Sorry to interrupt, Ashutosh.
No, thank you. But since going back to your example about how empires are coming to an end and the current one is likely to come to an end, when you talk economic resilience, this is the resilience of a country, it's the resilience of a city, it's the resilience of society, of families, of individuals across multiple economic strata. I'd love to get your perspective on how does economic resilience work for individuals in across the world.
So firstly, what you're describing is a holonic structure. It's something similar to Russian nested dolls.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is that it ripples all the way through. So as you've mentioned, starting right at the family level, even the individual level, then family, then community, and then scaling up to your city, your country, and globally. So we're all pretty much dependent on what we call a neoliberal system, where money is created and issued by central banks. And so the question is, do you try and build resilience within that system, which is itself fragile and will at some point come to an end? You can certainly try and do that, but it'll be very short-term resilience. And so the typical, mention is well, you've got to have a bit of savings and you've got to have a stockpile of food and you've maybe got to have your own garden. But those are short-term measures and they're very necessary. I'm much more of a big picture thinker, and therefore I'm concerned about longer term resilience, which is 50 to 100 years from now.
Okay.
And here it's building and it has to be community based. I think that's the point that hopefully will come out of our conversation. You can have two approaches to the inevitable demise of an empire. The first is a top-down approach, where it's pretty much people attempting to continue the business as usual model in an enforced top-down approach. But then what happens every time you have an empire that ends, you have something emerging from the bottom, grassroots movements. And in India, I know there's many of them happening. And these are communities coming together, place-based, and focusing on what they can do amongst themselves, building trust first among themselves, and then issuing their own currencies, looking after each other. There's various examples of how communities pool their commitments in a way that looks after each other. I wish we could go into more detail, but I'm aware that
maybe I'll schedule another conversation with you and go into much more depth. And the third leg is social resilience. Tell me a little bit more about social resilience and how does social resilience play a critical role in a community to withstand a crisis?
So here I'm going to use South Africa, my own country, as an example.
Yeah.
A few years ago, we had major riots in a province called KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah.
And this is where people eventually, it was soon after lockdowns, there were issues with food, and there was just a general frustration in the population, just reaching breaking point. And this is the point, I want to use that as an example, that every time an empire nears its end, you will see more and more social disruptions, riots. People, you've heard the phrase, the pitchforks are coming. So people will take to and those at the top of the power pyramid know this, and which is why they start implementing systems of more and more control, because they know that this pattern is repeated over and over again. So my encouragement would be, and this is a challenging one, rather than rising up and protesting, is to recognize that these patterns happen, and that it pushes you to the point of being immensely frustrated with the status quo, and then not being able to do anything about it. Now, unfortunately, your audience is probably aware of many of the things that we're discussing. So in a way, we're preaching to the converted. But there are others who still have their faith in these systems that are busy crumbling and collapsing and ending. And then are all confused when there's some kind of social disruption. So a riot is an example of where your social cohesion, the social fabric has completely frayed to the point that it's no longer holding the community together anymore. And then it becomes each man for himself, each person for themselves. And of course, that leads to all kinds of chaos. So ideally, in smaller communities, you're looking to build the resilience, the social bond, the trust amongst each other, being willing to help out your neighbor, being willing to work together when, for example, shelves in the supermarket are completely empty, when supply chains break down.
But just to discuss this a little more, when you talk of fragmentation uh, of communities, in most countries have over the last 100 years become fairly multicultural. And I also think there is a clash of cultures that's beginning to be seen across the world, whether it is based on religion, whether it is based on thinking, whether it is based on anything else. What are the challenges to bring in social resilience in highly fragmented or culturally fragmented communities?
You're asking deep questions here. So here's again a long answer, which I'll try and condense as much as possible. So we've spoken about the rise and fall of civilizations. We've mentioned that they go through very specific patterns, and so the process is reasonably predictable. There's another cycle that's unfolding right now, which is less visible, and that is the evolution of human consciousness. So we've been through four major, they call them major evolutionary transitions, METs. The first was when, prior to language being invented, we, came together as communities, but it was called the mimetic era, because all we knew was how to mime the actions of others. So we watched somebody making a tool, and then we learned how to create that tool as well, but there was still no spoken language. Then along came language, and that was a big shift in our consciousness, and we were able to tell stories and make sense of the world by telling those stories. There was a phase just between that, which was when we learned how to tame fire, but I'll skip over that one quite quickly. Then we had a major shift into material consciousness, which is how it was at that point that we learned how to take advantage of the resources around us. And we use those resources to build the material world that we know now. Now, there's an emerging form of consciousness called planetary consciousness, which views the planet as a living system. You've heard the phrases Gaia and so on. And this consciousness completely looks past cultural differences because it views us as all part of a living ecosystem. It sees a deep connection between humans and the non-human or the more than human world. So in that form of consciousness, there's very little division and reason for strife. Whereas the material consciousness, those that have become incredibly successful within that form of consciousness are stoking strife between cultures. The influx of people coming from different countries at the moment, that's part of stoking this feeling of, us versus them. And it's used to the elite's advantage, the people at the top of the pyramid, it's used to their advantage to keep us fighting against each other rather than coming together and building trust. So you'll find there are groups of people all over the world who've almost opted out of the existing system, and they're looking at alternative ways of living. These individuals have that planetary consciousness and view all of us as interconnected and absolutely reliant on each other. I hope I'm making sense at this point, because
making a lot of sense. Making a lot of sense. I wish I had the time to keep on talking to you for a much longer period of time, but I want to ask you just one question on the RISE framework and institute. Tell me a little bit about the RISE framework and institute, and what are its objectives?
So the RISE firstly stands for Resilient, Integrated Stewardship Ecosystems, with an emphasis on the word stewardship rather than ownership. So in the capitalist world, in the materialist consciousness, we've been very concerned about we must own our piece of land, we must own our vehicle, we must own things. Whereas in planetary consciousness, it's much more around how do we steward what has been given to us. And of course, these are well-known principles within indigenous cultures. So, you're very familiar with that space. Now, Rise, I had to just recollect my thoughts here.
Mm.
Where Rise came from is, firstly, I've spent more than a decade now working with many of the people that are firmly within planetary consciousness, and they're looking to find ways of bringing in new ways of being. And it dawned on me that very often, although they are incredibly bright ideas, there's a high level of naivety. In other words, there's little acknowledgement given to the existing systems. And if you have a very, an incredible idea that comes from planetary consciousness and you're trying to introduce it, you can either do it within a very insular communities, and there are many of these intentional communities that have sprung up all over the world, but they're too small to be scalable. It's when you try and scale these things that you hit against roadblocks or glass ceilings, or whatever the phrase you want to use. How do you engage with the existing private sector and public sector specifically? So the RISE framework emerged out of that thinking, saying, how do we bring these good ideas into a space where it makes sense within the public and private sectors? Now, as I started developing RISE, it very quickly dawned on me how complex this is and how carefully you need to consider the various incentive mechanisms at play. So RISE is almost a wake-up call that says, for you idealists who are working on some incredible stuff, if you want your idea to be scaled, you need to bring it into a framework that doesn't upset or alienate both the public and private sector. So RISE is an attempt to say, this is how complicated it is. And in a way, I've kind of shot myself in the foot, because in demonstrating how complicated it is, it now scares people away from attempting to do it. So what we're doing in this little valley where I'm in now is attempting to build a prototype so that we have a working, living example. It's fine putting a model together, but unless you can see a working example, it's very difficult for people to get their head around. So I think this is going to be multi-generational work. I could go into more of the detail about how RISE works, but it would scare your audience away. So we
will schedule another conversation, Michael, on the RISE framework, because I'm fascinated by it. But we've run out of time today, so I'm just going to say thank you so much for speaking to me about resilience. I think, while I did have an understanding of what is resilience, I had never looked at it in so much depth that, about ecological resilience, economic resilience, and social resilience. Each of these things, each of these three topics, you went into so much detail and gave such amazing anecdotes and examples. Thank you for speaking to me about resilience. We didn't have enough time to speak about the RISE framework at Institute, but I do want to talk to you at some time in the next few months in more detail about the RISE framework and go into much more depth on the topic of resilience. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Fascinating to meet you. Thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.